Morena, atamaria kia tātou katoa, ko Dr. Diana Kopua tēnei.
Morena.
E mihi kawana kia koutou
Atamaria
katoa.
kia
I'm setting
tātou
myself up. Tokoro koutou e whakarongo ana, nā reira mihi atu kia kōrua e tēnei ata. So, I'm up to, gee, I can't remember what number I'm up to. Must be 9 or 10. And we're in chapter 2. And I put up last night a copy of this alternative way of viewing drug action, and that's the drug-centered model. So please feel free to share any comments or questions. I'll try and talk them through, make sense of them. Okay. An alternative model of drug action, the drug-centered model. The drug-centered model of drug action highlights that psychiatric drugs cause general medical and behavioural alterations in anyone, regardless of whether or not they have a psychiatric diagnosis. Table 2 is alternative models of drug action, and again, I've put a copy of this table up last night in the Mahi Atua page. Table 2 illustrates the main contrasting features of the disease-centered and drug-centered models of action. The disease-centered model assumes that drugs exert their therapeutic effects by reversing an underlying biological abnormality or disease. In contrast, the drug-centered model says that psychiatric drugs influence symptoms by changing the way the body and brain normally work. Psychiatric drugs are particular sorts of chemicals that cross the blood-brain barrier and change the workings of the brain and nervous system. Sometimes we refer to drugs that can act in this way as psychoactive drugs or drugs with mind-altering properties. Through their effects on the brain, these drugs alter people's mental states and behaviour in characteristic ways. They can change our level of arousal or alertness, our perceptions, our thinking processes, and our emotions. In turn, these changes have knock-on effects on the way we behave while we are under the influence. Sorry, Hannah, wait. The door's creaking. That was distracting. I might have needed a mind-altering substance to keep focus. Right. Okay, where was I? They change our level of arousal or alertness, our perception, our thinking processes, and our emotions. In turn, these changes have knock-on effects on the way we behave while we are under the influence of the drug in question. These alterations occur in everyone who takes psychoactive drugs, subject to individual variation, and similar effects are seen in animals. Different sorts of substances produce different sorts of mental and behavioural alterations. These are determined by the chemical structure of the drug and how it interacts with brain processes. The mental changes induced by a drug and also reflected in physical alterations in most drugs affect many different body systems. The drowsiness and fatigue produced by a sedative drug, for example, are manifested in the mind and body and are associated with reduced activity of the heart and circulatory system, for example. Conversely, stimulants increase arousal along with cardiac activity and output. Many sedative drugs also impair the body's metabolism and make people put on weight. Therefore, psychoactive drugs are best understood as producing altered global biological states that have mental, behavioural and physical components. The psychoactive drugs we commonly hear about in these terms are used for recreational purposes like alcohol and illegal drugs such as cannabis, cocaine and heroin. All these drugs produce more or less subtle alterations to thinking processes, emotions and behaviours, and the nature of these alterations depends on their chemical composition. When a psychoactive drug is taken in large quantities, the alterations it induces will be extreme and obvious. Someone who has consumed a lot of alcohol will be staggering around drunk, for example. Smaller doses or weaker drugs have more subtle effects. Sometimes a drug-induced state is described as intoxication. This term reflects the fact that when a drug produces conspicuous changes in behaviour, it is likely to do some harm to the body and brain. Psychiatric drugs are not fundamentally different from recreational psychoactive drugs in these respects. They also modify normal brain functioning and produce characteristic altered states of feelings, thinking and behaviour that are different from the undrugged state. The immediate effects of recreational drugs are enjoyed by at least some people, although not necessarily by everyone. There is individual variation in how people experience the effects of drugs and in the sort of effects people like. Some drugs used in psychiatry also induce effects that are usually experienced as pleasant. The benzodiazepines such as diazepam, Valium, and stimulants like amphetamine, for example, have effects some people like and are used as recreational substances as well as being prescribed for mental health problems. On the other hand, some drugs prescribed in psychiatry produce mental and physical changes that are generally disliked. These include antipsychotics, lithium, and drugs known as mood stabilizers. All of these are generally experienced as unpleasant when taken by healthy volunteers who do not have a diagnosis of mental disorder. Many people who take antipsychotics to help with a mental disorder also dislike the way these drugs make them feel, although they may appreciate the effects on their symptoms. In fact, some people find the effects of drugs like antipsychotics so debilitating that they go to great lengths to avoid taking them and are often labelled as non-compliant or uncooperative as a consequence. The drug-centred model suggests that the drugs themselves create an abnormal or altered brain state that impacts on the feelings and behaviour that constitute the symptoms of mental disorders. And it is this impact that is described as a response to treatment. Drugs like benzodiazepines, for example, characteristically reduce arousal and induce a usually pleasant state of calmness and relaxation. This state may be experienced as a relief for someone who is intensely anxious or agitated. Alcohol can have the same effect, but taking a drug like this does not return the individual to a normal state in which their disorder and its symptoms have been eliminated. What happens is that the drug-induced state is superimposed onto the symptoms, and this state is regarded as preferable either by the sufferer themselves or others. Morena tiri. Another example of a drug-centred treatment is the recognised benefits of alcohol in social phobia. Alcohol can help people with social anxiety because it induces a state of intoxication that is characterised in part by a lessening of social inhibitions. Yet no one suggests that alcohol works by reversing an underlying biochemical imbalance or correcting an insufficiency of alcohol in the brain. Alcohol works because it imposes the alcohol-induced brain state onto the pre-existing anxiety. Morena Maria. We also recognise that alcohol intoxication modifies our underlying feelings when we talk of drowning our sorrows. This phase describes how the altered state of intoxication induced by alcohol can temporarily overwhelm and obscure underlying feelings of misery and depression. Opiate painkillers like morphine provide an example of a drug-centred treatment in general medicine. Other painkillers such as paracetamol and aspirin act exclusively in a disease-centred way by targeting the biological mechanisms that produce pain. They have no psychoactive effects. In other words, they do not change the way people feel or behave. Opiates, on the other hand, do have psychoactive properties. They produce pain relief partly by acting directly on pain conduction mechanisms in a disease-centred manner, but they also have drug-centred action by virtue of the fact that they make people feel drowsy and induce a sense of emotional indifference or detachment. People who have taken opiates for pain often say they still have some pain but do not care about it anymore. This aspect of their pain-relieving effects can be called a drug-centred action. Alcohol, too, was used as a painkiller before more effective and targeted drugs became available. Alcohol also reduces pain partly by making someone feel drowsy and drunk. Being in this state lessens people's awareness of the pain, another example of a drug-centred effect. According to a drug-centred model, therefore, Morena Carol, I'm Diana, not Diane, but Morena. According to a drug-centred model, therefore, psychiatric drugs, like other psychoactive drugs, produce a global state characterised by a range of physical and psychological alterations. These alterations are likely to interact with the symptoms of mental disorders in various ways, and sometimes this interaction may be beneficial. The drug-centred model stresses that taking a drug modifies the brain's normal biological state. Lithium orotate. No, I haven't. I'm imagining that it's lithium, but I haven't heard of the orotate. So the drug-centred model stresses that taking a drug modifies the drug's body's normal biological state. A drug is a foreign substance as far as the body is concerned. Any drug, that is, right? And the body automatically tries to counteract its effects. This places the body under stress because it's constantly straining to oppose the effects of the drug. Taking a psychiatric drug does not return a system that is functioning abnormally towards normal, as a disease-centred model assumes. It actually drives the body into an abnormal and biologically stressed state. Some drugs are more harmful than others, of course. Our bodies are able to cope with moderate and repeated caffeine ingestion without too many consequences, but other drugs are not so innocuous. Therefore, the drug-centred model helps to explain the harmful effects. The drug-centred model helps to explain the harmful effects that are potentially generated by taking any sort of drug on a long-term basis. Shall I carry on? I'm not sure if one more section. It's about 3/4 of a page. Okay, I'll keep going just for a bit. The spellbinding effects of psychiatric drugs. Psychiatrist Peter Breggin describes the effects of psychoactive substances, including psychiatric drugs, as disabling normal brain functions. Okay, so There is a psychiatrist who has described the effects of psychoactive substances, including our psychiatric drugs, as disabling normal brain function. Psychoactive drugs may slow us down or speed us up, or they may cause other more or less subtle changes. But whatever they do exactly, they generally reduce the flexibility and sensitivity of normal human reactions and behaviour. Kei te pai, Carol. I was having a giggle. As Bregan suggests, so that's really interesting, right? You get prescribed a psychoactive drug to help you feel normal again, but actually the psychoactive drugs that you're given is not doing that. It's, as the Bregan talked about, is disabling your normal functioning. However, there are possibly people who take it because it is better, the outcome is better than the experience of that person in distress. As Bregan suggests, psychoactive drugs like ECT and other brain modifying treatments impair higher human functions, including emotional responsiveness, social sensitivity, self-awareness or self-insight, autonomy and self-determination. That's interesting, right? So they impair our higher human functions, and that's therefore going to impact us, our ability to respond emotionally, impact our social sensitivity, our awareness of ourself, our self-insight, our autonomy and our self-determination. This generalized mental dysfunction can impair people's ability to perceive how the drug is affecting them, and sometimes leads to people thinking they are performing better than they really are. Bregan calls this effect spellbinding. We can see this effect with alcohol. When someone is under the influence of alcohol, we know they misjudge their capacity to do things like drive a car, for example, which is why we have drink driving laws. Similarly, people who smoke cannabis continuously often fail to recognise the extent to which their behaviour is negatively affected by the drug, including how they drive and productivity are diminished. Psychiatric drugs may also reduce people's awareness of the extent to which their mental capacities, emotional sensitivity and behaviour have been changed by the drug. Spellbinding is important because it suggests that sometimes people may not be able to weigh up the effects of a drug properly until they have stopped taking it and the effects have completely worn off. So tomorrow we'll go into the effects of long-term use, but I think that that's really important. So Joanna is proposing an alternative model, a disease-centered model and a drug-centered model. And a disease-centered model to taking drugs is that you take a drug because it's actually acting on these biological processes that are contributing to your experience, to your symptoms. It might not reverse the disease process, but it will reduce the harm from that process. A drug-centered view of taking drugs is that it is mind-altering. It impacts our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviours. And there are some drugs that Joanna talked about, including Panadol and aspirin, disease-centered drugs, whereas opiates, as pain reliefs, have some biological process, and then they have some mind-altering processes. Alcohol and cannabis is a mind-altering process, and our psychoactive drugs are mind-altering processes. And the problem with the mind-altering drugs, is that we often lose our ability to have self-awareness and self-insight and any connectedness to an emotional response to our environment. Think about that. Here we are in Mahi Atua wanting us to connect with our environment, to better critique. So to indigenize our space, our first principle, which would be much more difficult to connect to te taiao if you are on long-term substances. Also, to have a critical awareness of yourself. Our second principle is ka mā te ariki, ka mā te tauira, and that's about staying critical in our learning. Really difficult to do if you're on long-term psychoactive substances, but also really difficult to give feedback to your prescriber if you've actually lost sense of your insight, self-insight and self-determination. So it must be really difficult for you to sit in a room and have shared goals when you're actually not you're not functioning as your normal self. Although I imagine that for some, having the medication is so important to be able to function, and so it is different for different people. But it is important that we understand that this section is about an alternative model of looking at the drug taking within psychiatry, because it's not treating an underlying disease process. So that's the key here. Ka pai. Kia ora everyone. Kia ora, atamari. Just checking to see if anyone has any other questions. If not, then we'll see you tomorrow. I'll just hang on a bit just to see if you've got any questions. My coffee's cold again. Oh, ka pai, kia ora Georgette. I hope that it's good to see you online, your name, and I hope that you're keeping up with the readings. And just to show you again, this is the book. There's a series of books, and I know Georgette, I've talked to you about some of these things, and so I hope that it's really helpful. And yeah, see you guys all tomorrow. I felt like that was a little bit easier to follow. Sort of, many of us are used to mind-altering substances at some point of our life. Ka pai ngā mihi, kia pai o koutou rā, ka kite.